As the new year was getting started, things between the United States and Iran got really tense. Things came to a head when the United States launched a drone strike on January 3rd, killing a powerful Iranian general near the Iraq airport. Are we on the brink of a new war in the Middle East? Welcome to Talking Foreign Policy. I'm your host, Michael Scharf, Dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law. In this broadcast, our expert panelists will be discussing the 2020 U.S.-Iran crisis. We are joined today by Professor Milena Sterio, a chaired professor at Cleveland State's Marshall College of Law and a noted international law expert. Milena has been involved in several international law projects in Turkey and Jordan and Yemen in the past year. Milena, it is great to have you back on our program.
Thanks, Michael. It is great to be here.
And we also have Associate Dean Avidan, the director of Case Western Reserve's Institute for Global Security Law and Policy, and a former counsel to Human Rights First. Welcome, Avi.
Thanks for having me.
And we are happy to have with us once again Shannon French, a world-renowned military ethicist and director of the Inamori International Center for Ethical Leadership. Dr. French began her career as a professor at the U.S. Naval Academy. Welcome back to Talking Foreign Policy, Shannon.
Great to be here, Michael.
And it wouldn't be Talking Foreign Policy without Paul Williams, who is joining us from Washington, D.C. Dr. Williams is the president of the Public International Law and Policy Group, a Nobel Peace Prize-nominated NGO that has provided legal counsel in a dozen peace negotiations over the past 25 years, including in Syria, Iraq, the Sudan, and Yemen. Welcome back to our show, Paul.
Thanks, Michael. It's great to be back.
In our first segment, we'll explore how Iran and the U.S. got to the brink of all-out war. Milena Sterio, let's begin with you. It could be argued that the current crisis began a year and a half ago when President Trump pulled the United States out of the Iran nuclear accord. Can you tell us what that agreement did and why the Trump administration decided to withdraw the United States from it?
Sure. So this agreement, formerly known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, was an agreement signed back in 2015 in Vienna by China, the European Union, France, Germany, Russia, the UK, Iran, and the United States. And it was an agreement in which Iran agreed to reduce its uranium stockpile by about 98% over a 15-year period. And in exchange, the other treaty partners agreed to lift crippling economic sanctions off of Iran. Iran, by the way, also agreed to an international inspection regime. So inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency were allowed through this agreement to go into Iran and inspect their uranium enrichment facilities. President Trump, as a candidate back in 2016, labeled this deal as a really bad deal and basically pledged to, as he said, tear it up. President Trump said that it was a weak deal, that in 15 years it was about to expire. He just thought it was a bad deal and that we really should not be engaging with a rogue nation like Iran.
So not only did he tear it up, but he had the United States impose crippling sanctions on Iran. Avi Cover, how did Iran respond to that?
So Iran has taken a series of actions in response to these sanctions, one of which initially was attacking and seizing various oil tankers in the Persian Gulf. It was quite destabilizing. There were negotiations over some of this, and they ultimately relented in some of those circumstances. But the situation continued to escalate. They shot down a U.S. drone. And, in fact, one of the interesting things that in light of what we're talking about now is that it was noted at the time that President Trump showed surprising restraint. There was an expectation in some respects that the United States would act with greater force back then. In particular, Iran also took out Saudi Arabia's oil refining capacity, really, and really affected oil markets for a couple days. And finally, an Iranian-backed militia killed a U.S. contractor on a Kirkuk U.S. military base on December 27th. This seemed to be the final straw, if you will, that broke the back and led to the crisis that we are now facing.
And so right after that, the United States responded with its airstrikes. Is that right?
Yeah, first there were a series of airstrikes that killed about 25 militia fighters, and Iran-supported demonstrators laid siege to the U.S. Embassy, of course, in Baghdad. And so it was in that circumstance that we then had the attack on Soleimani.
And Paul, what do you want to add to that?
I think as we step back and we look at this, we see that this is sort of an arc of Iran testing to see whether the Trump policy was going to be markedly different than the Obama administration policy when it comes to deterring military action. The Iranians cannot retaliate economically, but they can militarily. And if you follow what Avni was saying, it was incremental until it finally was attacking bases directly, targeting a U.S. drone, and then targeting our embassy, which harkens back to the embassy takeover in Tehran in the 70s. And they basically were trying to figure out, is Trump going to accommodate them, or is he actually going to engage in serious deterrence?
So
I think that brings us to the next point.
I want to quote President Trump's tweet that occurred right after the embassy attack. He says, quote, "Iran will be held fully responsible for lives lost or damage incurred at any of our facilities. They will pay a very big price." That was all in caps. "This is not a warning. It is a threat. Happy New Year." End quote. So then on January 3rd, President Trump ordered the drone strike near the Baghdad airport that killed Qasem Soleimani. Shannon French, what can you tell us about this man?
Well, first of all, let's be clear. I don't think anyone should shed a tear over his loss. He was a horrible human being. He was a terrorist, and he enabled many terrorist militias and acts that did quite a lot of harm. And he was also, it should be noted, a brutal enforcer for an authoritarian regime and killed protesters within Iran. So we should start from the point of recognizing
let me ask you
that this was a bad man.
Other than with the protesters, is he a popular figure back in his country?
I think it's very hard to determine that, because I think there definitely are people with whom he is popular. He's a sign of strength. He's a sign of standing up to the West and other powers. But on the other hand, there are people who are afraid of him and even hate him, and they're not necessarily going to feel safe being loud about that. So I don't know that we should make sweeping statements about which side is stronger at the moment there.
So after Soleimani's death was announced, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo told ABC News, quote, "It's very clear that the world is a safer place today," end quote. It sounds like you would agree with that assessment.
No, actually, I wouldn't.
Okay.
I think the point that we have to make is saying he's a bad person is very separate from saying it's a good idea to kill him. Those are very different moves. For example, Kim Jong-un is a bad person and has done horrible things. I know, and we can talk about loss of Americans as well there, and we can talk about how the family of Otto feels about the loss of their son. There are many people around this planet right now who have committed horrific crimes. We don't assassinate all of them. When you do, it is because, or it's supposed to be because, you're preventing an imminent threat, an imminent attack. And we'll talk more about that, I'm sure. The argument for it being safer is that he was personally behind things that did cause the loss of human or cause human carnage in Iraq. In particular, he helped build a particular kind of operation of IEDs that actually was meant to maim.
Improvisational explosive devices.
That's right. And they were diabolical in that the way that they were built was actually to cause maximum carnage. So, that's not to be discounted. However, the militias that he enabled are still out there. It's not as though we can necessarily point to cases where the beheading approach has worked successfully.
Usually when you refer to somebody as a terrorist, you're talking about a non-state actor, an independent person. This is a man that you're referring to as a terrorist who had the military rank of major general of a country's army, and it's a country that has one of the biggest armies in the world. Does that make a difference?
It doesn't, I think, in his case, because that wasn't the only role that he played, or, as we trivially say, the only hat that he wore. He also worked with and directed non-state actors and militias that were not under state control. So had he been exclusively an Iranian general and worked only in that capacity, we might want to label him differently. But that is not the case. And he certainly worked with militias, Yemen, Syria, Iraq, and so forth.
And he's been doing this this for 15 years or more, right?
Oh, absolutely.
So my understanding is that the Bush administration, the Trump administration, they all had him under surveillance. They had Predator drones that could have taken him out, and they consciously decided not to. Let me ask Paul, Avi, or Milena, why do you think the other administrations didn't pull the trigger and this one did?
I think go ahead, Paul.
Go ahead, Paul.
I think it's reached ahead. I think the Iranians have upped their game. It's clear that Iran is a state sponsor of terrorism, that Soleimani was a terrorist, and that this was a targeted killing of an individual who was engaged in ongoing efforts to kill Americans. And I think there was some hope in the earlier years that Iran would change its behavior. It's clear the actions over the last 6 months that it was progressively engaging in heightened military actions under his leadership. And so it was a military act to deter future killings of Americans.
Milena.
Sure. So I just wanted to make a couple of points. One, this designation, when do we call somebody a terrorist? That is a State Department designation. The State Department can label an individual or an organization a terrorist. And President Trump has actually labeled the entire Iranian military as a terrorist organization, which is problematic in itself. So those are dependent. One administration can consider one individual a terrorist, and then the next administration could reverse course.
And just to be clear, that triggers certain legislation that freezes the assets
exactly
in banks of these individuals.
Exactly. So that is a very significant thing. Second thing, so here, Soleimani and the Quds forces had been labeled a terrorist organization under the George W. Bush administration, but the Trump administration actually labeled the entire Iranian military as a terrorist organization. The other thing I just wanted to...
So you're saying that we shouldn't be too concerned with people called terrorists in Iran.
Yeah, I think these are somewhat fluid. Exactly.
Yeah.
But the other point I wanted to make is on this difference between acting against a non-state actor and a state actor. I do think it's significant from the perspective of international law, which I know we'll talk about. Under international law, if you take out an official, a military general of a foreign nation, that could be seen as an armed attack on that country, which can then trigger a response under the law of self-defense from that country. So I'm sure that that's not the situation that we want to be in where we're now actively waging a war against Iran, and Iran is engaging in retaliatory strikes.
Avi, briefly, do you have anything to add?
I would only add, it's, the Bush administration, the Obama administration weren't exactly soft on Iraq. We had different ways in which they were trying to interdict and trying to neutralize Iran. Most notably, there was essentially a cyber war going on, whether it was using Stuxnet, Olympic Games, various other things that really tried to undermine their entire nuclear infrastructure. I think those might be classified, first off, as acts of war as well. But by the other side of things, maybe from a more policy side of things, this seems a far more provocative action. And that's probably why they chose not to do so.
Well, on that note, it is time for our first station break. When we return, we'll talk about the prospects for peace. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to Talking Foreign Policy, brought to you by Case Western Reserve University and WCPN 90.3 Idea Stream. I'm Michael Scharf, Dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law. We're talking today about the 2020 U.S.-Iran crisis. Before the break, we were discussing the causes of the crisis. In this segment, we'll examine the legality of the January 3rd U.S. airstrikes on Iran General Soleimani. Milena, Sterio, you have written extensively about the legality of use of force under international law. What was the U.S. legal case for the killing of the Iranian general?
Sure. So the United States claimed basically that it was acting in self-defense and that it was acting to prevent a serious imminent attack against the United States' national security interests. Now, under international law, a state can use force against another state only if it has United Nations Security Council authorization or in self-defense. Here, clearly, there is no Security Council authorization, so the United States, to justify this legally under international law, has to invoke the law of self-defense. The key thing here is that the United States would have to demonstrate that there was an imminent threat coming from Soleimani. So far, the intelligence does not back that up. There could be intelligence, from the U.S. Agencies, military, what have you, that could demonstrate that there was an imminent threat. But so far, we haven't seen that.
And when the U.S. acts in self-defense, doesn't the United Nations Charter require it to report to the Security Council?
Exactly. Yes, it does. Under Article 51 of the UN Charter, the United States would have to report back and provide the Security Council with detail about, why it acted in self-defense. That has not happened as of now.
All right. So, Shannon French, President Trump has spent much of his presidency attacking U.S. intelligence agencies, rejecting their conclusions on critical national security issues, ranging from Russia's interference in the 2016 presidential election to the complicity of Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Do you find it surprising that President Trump and other U.S. officials have pinned the decision to target General Soleimani on intelligence from the same agencies that the president has so frequently disparaged?
Well, consistency has not been a hallmark of this administration. So I don't think it's surprising in that sense. I do think it's incredibly frustrating, the inconsistency, and the fact that we've had folks like Esper come on and say, well, no, I didn't see that intelligence that the president is referencing. And if he didn't see it, who did?
Esper being the the director of
Secretary of Defense.
Secretary of Defense, right.
And the idea that we would have people that high up in the organization saying they haven't seen something which the president is citing as justification is incredibly troubling. And I think we are also back at the point I made earlier that you mentioned the Saudi Crown Prince, where there have been clear indications of crimes against Americans, American citizens, American residents, and no action. So we can't say that there's consistency in the actual responses as well.
I mean, sometimes the intelligence really isn't that good as well. I mean, for example, when the United States went to war against Iraq in 2003, it was because Iraq was supposed to have all these chemical weapons and was just a couple of weeks away from having nuclear weapons, and nobody ever found those. Is that correct?
Well, it's correct that the WMD reasoning that was used and Colin Powell speaking and making this argument turned out to not be based in fact. I'm not sure how much of that I would want to lay on the doorstep of the intelligence community. I think they've been through a lot lately, and we should be very careful about blaming them for what may have been political decisions and what may have been driven by listening to certain voices, in that case coming out of Iraq, who had their own agendas, and taking seriously what you wanted to hear in order to get the end result that was already in people's minds. So, I feel like that was a conclusion looking for an argument.
So between Trump's criticisms of the intelligence communities and the history back then, you could forgive the common person on the street for being a little skeptical, right? Well, what makes this case even more bizarre is that on January 14th, President Trump and Attorney General Barr said that it really didn't matter if General Qasem Soleimani posed an imminent threat to Americans when he was killed by the U.S. drone strike. Milena, you said it did matter. Yes. Is this consistent with international law? What do you make of this new statement?
Sure. So it's not consistent. I would argue it is not consistent with international law. It is somewhat consistent with prior U.S. policies, namely under President George W. Bush in the wake of 9/11. President Bush advanced the so-called Bush Doctrine of of preemptive self-defense, under which basically the United States would have the right to act against individuals who pose some sort of a threat to the United States, even if that threat is not necessarily imminent. So I do think that the Trump comments are consistent with the Bush doctrine, with the Bush administration views in the wake of 9/11, but are not consistent with international law.
Well, let me ask Professor Avi Cover a question. A lot of us have just recently seen that movie Midway, which was terrific, that came out over the holidays. What a lot of people don't know is after the Japanese admiral orchestrated the Midway battle, later, not long after, he was flying in an aircraft, and the United States, through its intelligence, figured out which airplane it was and blew him up. And he wasn't at that moment engaged in hostilities. Isn't that sort of what has happened in this case? And Avi Cover, was that legal?
Well, so that was during a state of armed conflict, right? So there was clearly a war going on. He's a clear, legitimate military target. I think here that's part of the issue. Is there a war going on? Is there a state of armed conflict? And that raises a whole inquiry, I think, into American U.S. law, right? It's Congress that has the authority to declare war. There's been no declaration
but we haven't
of war
had
here.
a declared war since World War II, right?
Right. So if Congress hasn't declared war, then there's a couple of ways that the president might be able to act. One is a question of whether there's been an authorization of military force in some capacity. And much speculation is that the administration might well be relying on what's called the authorization for use of military force against Iraq to support its attack on Soleimani. Now, think about that right there. The language of that authorization for use of military force specifically says against Iraq. Not against Iran.
Soleimani was in Iraq.
He was in, right?
And,
so the
and
idea
he was
here is-
accused of terrorist acts in Iraq against
absolutely.
our people.
Well, against right. So the issue then becomes, right, the purpose of the AUMF in Iraq, as it's known, right, is to support and stabilize Iraq, right? Here we have the government of Iraq outraged over this attack, right? It's hard to make the argument that the attack on Soleimani has actually led to stability, nor that it's authorized by Congress, right, back in 2002 for this sort of action. But the other authority that clearly, certainly the President's Attorney General is a big fan of, Bob Barr, would be simply that there is inherent authority under Article 2 of the Constitution, that the President has this power as Commander-in-Chief to do so, doesn't need congressional authorization. The problem there, and you're certainly right, there's been plenty of U.S. military action that's been taken in the absence of congressional authorization. Then the question is, was this action, is this action taken for a brief period of time? Is it going to lead to war? And is it in U.S. national interests? And the question might be, right, if indeed we've just talked about how this may escalate and lead to a war, right, to take this sort of action, however discreet it might seem, if it's going to escalate a war, then that is highly problematic and might run afoul of the president's inherent authority under Article 2.
I want to get back to the first thing that you said, which is, are we already in a war, whether it's authorized by domestic statutes or not? When Paul Williams and Milena and Shannon were describing the tit-for-tat escalation of the violence between these two countries over the last 2 months, at what point does that cross the threshold and can be considered a war, whether it's declared or not? Paul Williams, do you have a thought on that?
Well, I think it's clearly crossed the threshold into terrorism. And when we talk about Iran, we have to be very careful about applying sort of square, frameworks of international law to what is really a round peg. Iran for decades has been a state sponsor of terrorism. And so it's less of more of a traditional analysis of a straight-up declaration of war or a peace-loving state which may find itself in a conflict. This is a state who uses terrorism as a means of its foreign policy, and that terrorism involves killing Americans, civilians and service personnel. Just these past couple of years, the Iranians have tried to engage in terrorist acts in France, in Denmark, in the United States. And so you find a situation where you shift out of the traditional legal analysis of whether it's a war or not and into whether it's targeted killing of designated terrorists. And I think that's where we found ourselves. And I think there's plenty of legal authority for this type of action to remove a terrorist who's engaged in ongoing planning and implementation of actions against Americans and our allies.
So let me turn to Shannon French. Shannon has written a book called The Code of the Warrior, which is a critically acclaimed book. I definitely think everybody ought to read it.
Thank you.
It's right on point with what we're talking about. How does the killing of General Soleimani fit within the just war theory that you talk about in your book?
Well, the just war tradition actually has quite a lot to say about these topics that are relevant in the public debate at the moment. And just to give a few key examples, we touched on one a moment ago. One of the core criteria for just war theory is that you have to have a legitimate authority. And basically the idea is you don't just want anyone at all declaring war or acting in a way that will cause a war. I should point out that these criteria are supposed to prevent wars. They have not necessarily been good at that throughout the centuries, but that was the aim. So the idea that the authority is somewhat questionable in this case, arguably on both sides, is intriguing. So on the one hand, you have the questions that Avi raised, like, does the AUMF actually authorize this kind of action still, or have we stretched that far beyond the breaking point from what it was originally done? You're quite right that we haven't declared war properly since World War II, but there's a lot of voices saying we need to cut that out and go back to having Congress holding that responsibility tight and not giving so much over to the executive. And then on the other side, you have these questions that Paul was raising as well around what kind of authority do we have in Iran, and how are we going to recognize the state and sovereignty there when it's mixed up in some of this other language of terrorism and rogue nations. And then you have other criteria from the just war tradition that come into play. You're supposed to act from a righteous intention. Flowery language, but the idea is that it can't be, for example, an action taken out of revenge, which was something we touched on earlier. And also it can't be done as a distraction for domestic troubles or anything else. It can't be a wag the dog scenario, has come
we'll
out.
Talk about that in a few minutes.
Absolutely.
So the other debate we seem to be having here is between Milena and Paul, because Milena says there is a difference if you attack a general who's an official of a country at which we are not at war. And Avi says we are not right now at war with Iran. And Paul, who says, hey, if you're a general that's engaging in terrorism, you're just like any other terrorist. But couldn't the same be said about the people in the U.S. Army from the perspective of other countries where we're using our Predator drones to attack without permission by the United Nations?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a big danger here, because another nation could basically act in a similar way, designate a military official from the United States or from one of our allies as a terrorist, and then take out that person on the territory of a third country. So the main purpose of international law is to prevent these kinds of actions. So that's, the big role of international law is to make sure that we have peace and security, and that nations are not acting against the sovereignty of other states.
And Avi was telling us about the potential lack of authority to undertake this kind of military force. But there's a whole nother issue of U.S. domestic authority, and those are the prohibitions on government or political assassination. And I wonder if the fact that this is a government official, a general from a country that we're not officially at war with, does that trigger the executive orders against assassination, 123333?
Sure. So Executive Order 12333, which you just mentioned, signed back in 1981 by then President Reagan, bans political assassinations and says, quote, no person employed by or acting on behalf of the U.S. government shall engage in or conspire to engage in assassination, end of quote.
And I want to point out, it was actually in place even before President Reagan,
Ford,
under
correct.
General Ford,
yes.
Right.
So the issue here is that the Trump administration is going to say, no, this is not a political assassination. This is a targeted killing. And as Paul said, once you start linking Soleimani to terrorism, then the U.S. has argued for years under the Obama administration and the Bush administration that we have the authority to carry out targeted killings of terrorists, and that these are not political assassinations.
Now, Avi, these other authorities that you were talking about were passed by the legislature. This executive order was adopted by a series of presidents. Does that mean that it's not really binding?
The executive order? No,
Yeah.
Well, certainly can be binding, but I think Congress needs to step up. And this has been an issue for...
Can't the president, just give himself an exception, or just declare that the executive order which he has adopted is not applicable to this situation?
Again, if there is direct congressional action that's taken that's in contravention of the executive action, the congressional law can well exceed that. and that is to say the congressional law should govern and prevail, right? Particularly if you're doing a constitutional analysis in terms of separation of powers. But Congress has abdicated its responsibility for decades here. This is not simply an issue of just the Trump administration. Certainly since 9/11, we have seen Congress give, by and large, a blank check to the executive to wage a war against terrorism, to wage a war against Iraq. They've had ample opportunity through various administrations of either party to take action and rein in the president, and they have failed to do so. And so now there's current talk of both houses of Congress passing various resolutions that might be in keeping with the War Powers Resolution to try and constrain the president. That would be a welcome step.
Well, and in fact, on January 9th, the House of Representatives, which is democratically controlled, voted 224 to 194 to adopt a resolution limiting the powers of the president to conduct military action against Iran without further congressional approval. So what effect is that going to have?
Well, it's certainly a welcome step. It's an important statement. The Senate is expected to pass something with maybe even more teeth that would be in keeping with the War Powers
You think so?
Resolution.
The Republican-controlled Senate?
There's an expectation that they will have a majority, that there's a number of senators, Rand Paul, Mike Lee, who are quite critical of expansive presidential powers. However, the president can simply veto those resolutions, right? They're not necessarily going to limit and constrain the president. So, again, this is something that requires bipartisan action.
And there's no way they're going to get two-thirds to override a veto.
That seems, hardly foreseeable. That said, there's been a lot of reports of the Trump administration's presentation of intelligence that was very unacceptable to people on both sides of the aisle. The administration clearly seems to have not been forthcoming with Congress, which is what Congress's prerogative is to do. They're supposed to execute oversight and ultimately have the power of the purse, which, of course, is another way to perhaps constrain the president here.
So part of what's playing out in the background is a tug of war between the legislative branch and the executive branch, not just with respect to the Iran crisis, but in a whole lot of areas. Are you suggesting, and anybody can weigh in, that this might be the tipping point that will cause the legislative branch to step up and say enough's enough?
I mean, I think there certainly has to be a recognition that if you're going to allow the president carte blanche, whomever is the president, you're giving him that authority. And Trump might indeed be the president who's going to prove that, we've given just too much authority.
Does this concern anybody else?
Yeah, and I think I just wanted to comment really briefly on what Avi said about it's time that Congress stepped in. And I agree with that because post 9/11, basically the executive branch has taken more and more powers in this area. And they've there are all these memoranda that have been issued by the Office of Legal Counsel, which is within the executive branch, that basically kind of slowly give more and more power to the executive branch without, to engage in this type of conduct without congressional authorization. So unless Congress were to step in and say, hey, you can't do that, this is just going to continue.
All right. And Shannon.
Well, I was just going to add that, of course, the reason for all these checks and balances in the first place is that we know power corrupts. And that's what the founders had in mind. So the fact that this imbalance has been allowed to proceed means that it will continue to cause actions that are going to make us all less safe.
All right. Well, it's time for another short break. When we return, I'm going to ask our experts to look into their crystal balls and predict how the U.S.-Iran crisis is going to play out internationally and how it will affect the U.S. presidential election. Back in a moment. This is Michael Scharf, and we're back with Talking Foreign Policy. I'm joined today by some of the world's foremost international law and foreign policy experts, and we've been talking about the 2020 Iran-U.S. crisis, which seems to be reaching a tipping point when the United States killed Iran's military leader with a drone strike on January 3rd. In this final segment of our show, we'll look at the question of what comes next. Professor Avi Cover, after the killing of the general, Iran leaders warned that they had 35 U.S. retaliatory targets to choose from. What types of targets do you think Iran had in mind?
I think what's one of the scary things about here, maybe one of the really frightening aspects in why Obama and Bush did not act, is that I think we really don't know. It's very hard to predict. Notably, Iran did act in response to a U.S. base in Iraq. They seem to have acted with a certain level of restraint. They've certainly spoken, I think, from their leadership in certain measured tones of a desire not to escalate these matters. All of that said, I think no one, and we take what Professor Shannon French said at the outset, this is a government and with a leader who are set out to do all sorts of things, use their proxies, terrorist actions through Hezbollah and other actions. We could envision things in Argentina, Bulgaria, in Israel, throughout the Middle East, against our allies, against United States interests. There certainly could be cyber war actions taken. I don't think, we should take too much stock in their words, but there is some, I suppose, cautious optimism I have in their initially measured response.
So not to be outdone, President Trump immediately said that he had 52 Iranian targets in mind, including, he said, cultural sites. Shannon French, as a military ethicist, what do you make of that threat?
Well, it's a war crime that he's threatening, so I'm against it. I'd like to be clear on that. But I actually think it's important that we also think about why would an ethicist like me and so many other people be against this, because it's really quite profound. When you're talking about protecting cultural sites, you're talking about something that belongs not even just to a single culture or to a single country. While that does matter, and it's important to acknowledge the role of some of these important sites in Iranian culture,
and just for a
these
second,
belong to humanity.
Tell us about some of these sites. I don't think everybody in the audience knows the scope of the kinds of archaeological treasures that are in Iran.
Well, the richness of the Persian culture has informed so much, and even the lines we draw today about East and West are really artificial. Much of what we value today in art, architecture, has come through the prism of this. And so some of these things that were being threatened, I don't know all 52 of the targets that he had in mind, but having seen some of the images, these are things that, if lost, would never be seen again by future generations. Our children would never get to see them. And I'm reminded of how everyone felt when the Buddhas were destroyed. And even the recent, even though this was not intentional, but the loss of Notre Dame. These are things that mean more than an ordinary building.
And for those in the audience that aren't experts at the laws of war, no matter how bad a conflict is, there are just certain things that you're not allowed to attack?
That's exactly right. And our forces go into conflicts with what's called a no-strike list. And there are places that you're not allowed to target, and those are to preserve these greater values that go beyond the individual conflict. And I have to say that goes all the way back to some of our most ancient concepts of warrior codes. Even in the Old Testament of the Bible, in Deuteronomy, it talks about things like not cutting down the fruit trees. And the argument there is that if you cut down the fruit trees, it takes so long for them to grow up to the point where they can bear fruit again that you're again punishing future generations, and that's a special evil.
You spend a lot of time with military members at conferences and so forth.
I do. I was just at Quantico last month.
Right. So if the president gave him a direct order to destroy some of the most profound archaeological sites in Iran, would they follow it?
No, it would be an illegal order, and they are required to refuse. I trust them.
That's interesting. Do you all think that? Are you that sanguine about it?
I would like to agree with that, and I actually really hope that you are right. But it is absolutely true that following an illegal order is something that our troops are trained not to do.
All right. Well, Paul, Avi suggested that some of the possible targets were all over the place. Is there a risk that this conflict with Iran can spill over to Iraq and Afghanistan and set back some of the efforts of establishing peace and stability in those countries with which you have been so involved?
Yes, most definitely, and I think for two primary reasons. One is that this will be an asymmetric conflict. Iran has no hope whatsoever of meeting, America on the battlefield, so to speak. It would, the conflict would last less than a day. And so Iran, if this does tip into some type of more hot or active conflict, is going to look initially to Iraq and to Afghanistan to destabilize those countries and America's interest in those countries. And then it has a long reach of its terrorist network through Syria, into Lebanon, into Yemen, and then overseas, as Avni had mentioned as well. The other reason is that both main actors are highly unpredictable. Part of Iran's policy is to be unpredictable. That's its strategy, both politically and militarily in terms of how and when it engages in terrorism. But what the wild card is the United States is now unpredictable. Usually the United States has a very clear military policy and a very clear political policy, and it uses those two in tandem to deter rogue states or these bad actors. But we've seen, the unpredictability in the last couple of years, and the question is whether this targeted killing of Soleimani is actually part of an arc of a policy of deterrence, or whether it was just a reaction to the attack on the American military base, and now we're back into a void of policy. And I think that is what's going to be destabilizing, is these two primary actors. Neither one of them has a playbook of unpredictability. The other one, us, the Americans, don't really seem to have a playbook at this point in time, and that makes this conflict very dangerous.
So on the flip side of that, when Iran fired the missiles at the U.S. air bases in Iraq in retaliation for our killing of their general, apparently they notified the Iraqi authorities, who notified our people in the air base, and nobody was killed. And that is being described as restraint, taking symbolic action when they could have taken more serious action. And President Trump appears to have stood down, calling for sanctions and diplomacy rather than taking the next step. Let me ask all of you, is this a signal that the crisis is over? Or how do you interpret that?
I mean, I would say rather than being over, it's going to slip into other realms. I mean, we have a lot of reason to fear cyber attacks in particular, and we've already mentioned so many proxies that are connected to this. And I actually feel like it might not always be clear what is going to trace back to the killing of Soleimani. We won't always know that this actually was provoked initially by that.
And Michael, I would just add that I absolutely agree with Paul that Iran and the United States, but Iran in particular, part of their policy is to be unpredictable. While they're unpredictable, they're not irrational. So I don't think that they would purposely go ahead and strike a U.S. base and kill, American soldiers. I think they know that could, escalate the conflict. And I also agree with Paul that if it came to an actual conflict, actual war, they know that they would lose that war in a matter of hours. So I don't think that they're irrational.
Now, they have a huge army. They have a nuclear facility. I don't think they have yet built nuclear bombs like North Korea have, but they have other kinds of ballistic missiles and so forth. And my understanding is that the United States has been creating certain weapons that are focused specifically on Iran, like the Moab, that's the mother of all bombs that they tested out in Afghanistan, and it blew an entire mountain away. And now there is actually these low-yield nuclear weapons that the United States has now added to its arsenal. Is this signaling Iran, or is this preparing for an attack on Iran? How do you interpret those actions?
I mean, that's a tricky one. And I would add that, by the way, yes, U.S. has all these weapons. And although we don't think that Iran has the nuclear, bomb developed, Iran has announced that it is officially stepping out of the Iran nuclear deal, which we mentioned at the beginning of the program. So Iran now, although up until recently, while it was still covered by the program, was actually in compliance with the restrictions that were part of the deal on enriching uranium, which was preventing its ability to develop nuclear weapons. Iran is now saying basically, we're out of this deal. You, the United States, you abandoned the deal. We're out. We can start enriching uranium. And so the potential for a bad conflict. The potential for a serious escalation is there. And I honestly don't think that it's in our national security interest to go down this route, even though we probably would win, we definitely would win a war against Iran.
And you were saying Iran gets this. And I want to ask you also about this Ukrainian passenger plane that blew up as it was taking off from Iran. Iran then admitted pretty quickly, I guess, that it was responsible. Was that another effort to de-escalate tensions, or was there something else behind that? What do we make of that story?
I don't think.
Let's turn to Paul. Paul, have you thought about that?
Yeah, Michael, I would not characterize that as a de-escalation. I would characterize that as business as usual. The Iranians may be very good at terrorist actions. They're not very good at traditional military defense. They shot down with 2 missiles this Ukrainian airliner, thinking it was an incoming cruise missile, although it took off from the airport in Tehran. And then they sat on it for 3 days, generating their usual sort of this is Western propaganda, until American intelligence, European intelligence, and Iranians with basically YouTube videos demonstrating that it was in fact the Iranians who had shot it down. So basically their bluff was called by their own people. And this has led to a number of demonstrations, because a number of Iranians were killed. We keep calling it the Ukrainian airline, but a number of Iranians, as well as Brits, Canadians, and Ukrainians, were killed. This might be not American deterrence and American policy, but the Iranians doing business as usual and lying about their bad acts or their incompetent acts, which causes the Iranian people to really have second thoughts about whether they want to continue with this regime. And that might be one of the most important factors in this development these last 6 weeks.
One of the most unusual aspects of this crisis is that it is unfolding at just the moment that the U.S. Senate is set to begin its impeachment trial of President Trump. And you, Shannon French, described this as a wag the dog situation. There was a famous movie a couple of years ago where there was a president who things weren't going so well, and so he created a fictional war in order to get his popularity up just before an election. Do you really think that that's what's going on here?
I'm not sure I'm convinced that's necessarily what's happening here, but I think it's bad enough that we're worried that it could be. I mean, we have evidence before us, including things like President Trump having tweeted years ago that Obama was likely, then President Obama, was likely to start a war with Iran in order to get reelected. And unfortunately, we know that President Trump is quite prone to projection. So having suggested that someone else might do this, it's not crazy to assume that he might have had those thoughts as well. But I think the overarching point is how troubling it is that it's plausible. The fact that we have to worry that the motive is not anything to do with genuine interests of the nation, but might be to do with these political motives is a bad place to be, but that's where we are.
Yeah, so I absolutely agree with Shannon. The question is, why strike now? I absolutely agree with Shannon that Soleimani was not a good person. He had done a lot of bad things. We could agree that he was a terrorist. But the question really is, what now? What was he doing in December or early January of 2020 to warrant the strike now? We know that the prior administrations knew where he was, had contemplated a strike against him, perhaps at times where he was actually engaged in more imminent plotting of attacks against the United States. And unless the Trump administration can come forward with intelligence that shows the type of imminent attacks that he was plotting now, it is just hard to understand why strike against him now.
So this really transforms the issue that you raised earlier about imminence, which is a legal issue for self-defense, into a political issue, making us wonder why now. Because what the Trump administration is basically saying is we don't have to prove that there was any imminence. Well, maybe they don't for some theories of international law, but don't you for political reasons?
Well, that's part of, it is election season here in the United States. The Iowa caucuses are coming up. But it seems to me that these foreign policy issues, absent a serious escalation, have just not dominated the political debates. And so it seems to me that absent some serious developments and escalation in the conflict, I don't think that this will matter as much.
Shannon.
Well, I just wanted to add again that the inconsistency is also part of the problem here. And the fact that the other very bad men that are out there are not being treated the same way. And the most obvious example that I mentioned before is that of Kim Jong-un. And rather than going after him, Trump has made jokes about exchanging love letters with him. So it can't be the case that just because of the bad actions of this person, this was taken. There have to be other things. And if the other things don't amount to imminent threat, then we have to worry what else it could be driving this.
Avi.
Yeah, I mean, if I can just take a contrary standpoint for a little bit, is just to think of one problem, and Shannon, you began at the outset calling Soleimani a terrorist, is, of course, we have had a policy now for over a decade of targeted killings. We've killed thousands of people, call them assassinations, call them targeted killings. That's been a policy of this country. And so one can certainly see, I think, a through line from the beginning of that policy, not long after 9/11,
how many of
through
them
Soleimani's
were
killing.
military members of a
No,
foreign
agreed.
country?
But I think this is, it's a matter, I mean, there's a question of whether it's a matter of degree or rather a matter of kind. We've started this practice. We continue to do it. There is fallout from those killings wherever they occur. There's collateral damage. And I think we're reaping what we've sown.
And Milena was suggesting that this might become a major campaign issue for the presidential election. ABC News conducted a poll to figure this out. And the poll last week said that 56% of Americans said that they disapprove of President Trump's handling of the heightened tensions with Iran. 56%, does that surprise you? Is that high? Is that low?
No, I mean, it doesn't surprise me, but at the same time, the Trump supporters, people who support President Trump, believe, I think most of them believe in targeted killings. Most of them see this as just another, as Avi was saying, just another targeted killing of a terrorist. Love the fact that the Trump administration is so unpredictable. Actually love the inconsistency of President Trump's actions and think that's a good thing. So I really don't think that this will change things significantly for the upcoming election.
Paul Williams, do you think the people of America should care about this?
I think they do care. I think the 56% number shows that the Americans are interested in a serious and a competent and a consistent approach to dealing with state sponsors of terrorism. They see Iran as projecting its interest in an area where we have allies and where we have strategic interest, and they just want a competent and capable policy to contain Iran. I think that is an issue. Whether it rises to the political debates or not, I don't know. But the Americans care about it. They're focused on it, and they want us to get it right.
Well, and how are they supposed to assess this?
They're supposed to assess this whether or not we have a clear policy and whether the consequences of that policy are containing the Iranians. Shooting 22 missiles into a U.S. base in Iraq is not a consistent policy that contains the Iranians, which I think is why you had the targeted killing. Now, the stand down may weaken that deterrence, or the lack of an articulable deterrence policy may also weaken our ability to contain them.
All right. Well, Paul, that's going to be the last word. Our producer is indicating that it's time for us to wrap up our program. So let me say, Paul Williams, Milena Sterio, Shannon French, and Avidan Cover, thank you for providing your insights on the U.S.-Iran crisis. I'm sure the audience will be following the next steps very closely with a better understanding because of what you've said today. I'm Michael Scharf. You've been listening to Talking Foreign Policy.
Talking Foreign Policy is a production of Case Western Reserve University and is produced in partnership with 90.3 FM WCPN IdeaStream. Questions and comments about the topics discussed on this show, or to suggest future topics, go to talkingforeignpolicy@case.edu. That's Talking Foreign Policy, all one word, @case.edu.